global scene this week, shifting policies and power plays have dominated headlines. From the Middle East tensions between Israel and Hamas to the cancelled Trump-Putin meeting earlier slated for Budapest. Still, Western allies continue to tighten sanctions over Russian oil, while President Donald Trump has announced a halt on trade talks with Canada. Now, back home in Africa, post-election unrest grips Amazonia and colonial French Cameroon regions as civilians await final result. Gen Z voters are denouncing alleged electoral fraud and calling for transparency. Meanwhile, Amazonian President His Excellency Samuel Ikome Sako has remained a vocal figure in shaping discussions on U.S. foreign policy in Africa, especially as the United States continues to eyes its next big deal on the continent amid growing Chinese and Russian influence. Now on the war front, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continues to rally allies for support, urging the release of frozen Russian assets, even as global momentum begins to wane. Could this asset finance the war in Ukraine? All this and more will be explored in today's Global News. Welcome to Global News. I am Tabitha Arko. Let's begin. European allies of Ukraine are pressing for the swift use of frozen Russian assets to sustain Kyiv's defense amid economic resilience. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosted the Coalition of the Willing summit with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and other European leaders. Discussion centered on unlocking frozen Russian funds, expanding long-range missile support, and also restricting Russian oil and gas export. Now let's take a look.
If Russia brought war to our land and they have to pay for this war. In any case, one of the ways to pressure on them, and by the way, they're afraid very much that Europe will make this union decision. And of course, one of the way is to use frozen assets. The main thing that today, I hope, God bless, that now there is they have meeting and the EU leaders, and I hope that they will make political decision, positive decision in one or another way to help Ukraine with funds, basing on frozen assets.
Zelensky hopes for a positive decision, but we'll see that the talks came shortly after the United States President Donald Trump imposed sanctions on Russia's two largest oil firms, a sharp departure from his earlier diplomatic overtures toward President Vladimir Putin. The move has reinvigorated transatlantic coordination, yet uncertainty lingers over Washington's next steps. Will symbolic sanctions translate into sustained strategic support for Ukraine, as we are seeing, or are they merely a political gesture to restore credibility among NATO allies? Meanwhile, European Union leaders on Thursday stopped short of approving a plan to use frozen Russian reserves, much of which are held in Belgium, to finance a large loan package for Ukraine. Despite the urgency, legal and financial concerns continue to divide the bloc. British officials say time is running out. Starmer emphasized that the window for decisive action is narrowing, urging that progress be achieved within a short timetable. Also, the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen added that a solution should be reached before Christmas to ensure stable funding for Ukraine's defense. President Zelensky continues to call for a positive feedback as regarding these. But then, looking at Europe's ally, can Europe overcome its internal hesitation as it stands and translate mere talks into action? What is then the stand of the US? NATO's Mark Rutte confirmed that the US is still reviewing whether to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, while Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof called for the EU to align with United States and British sanctions on Russian oil. The United States remains the pivotal player in Ukraine's long-term defense equation. Yet, as Washington weighs its options, is the hesitation a sign of strategic caution or growing fatigue with a costly war that shows no clear end in sight? Trump's administration has toughened its rhetoric. This minute, they want to broker a deal. Next minute, Putin has to be pressured. However, Russia has strengthened retaliation. The Kremlin wants of a painful response if its frozen assets are seized. President Putin downplayed the latest U.S. sanctions as unfriendly, insisting they would have little impact on Russia's economy. Yet, economists question whether Moscow can sustain its resilience amid prolonged financial isolation. Will Russia's economic defiance hold? Or is the pressure gradually eroding the foundations of its wartime stability? Let's hear about that.
Well, that's what we agreed upon. And now I am familiar with this statement. The President of the United States has decided to cancel or postpone this meeting. Rather, he is speaking about postponing this meeting. Well, what can I say? Dialogue is always better than any confrontation, than any disputes, or all the more so than war. Therefore, we have always supported this, the continuation of dialogue, and we support it now. Now, regarding the new sanctions, first of all, there is nothing new here. Yes, of course, they are serious for us, that is clear, and they will have certain consequences, but they will not significantly affect our economic well-being.
Still on, President Zelensky began his visit to Britain with a meeting with King Charles at Windsor Castle before attending the London summit. He continues to urge Western partners to translate pledges into practical support as the conflict grinds into another winter. With fatigue setting in across Europe and the US, how sustainable is the political will to keep funding Ukraine's war effort? We see that the London summit reflects a broader shift from reactive diplomacy to proactive financial warfare against Russia. But the real test lies not in promises, but in following up, really. Now, that's all for Ukraine and Russia, the latest and new development coming over from that story. Now, moving over to the church in Italy. The church in Italy, victims of clergy abuse identified in Italy, has been identified in Italy since 2020. Almost 4,400 people in Italy have been victims of sexual abuse by Catholic priests and church workers in cases reported since 2020. According to new figures compiled by Reed Abuso, the country's largest survivors network. The group said its findings were based on testimonies, court documents, and media investigations, underscoring the absence of an official nationwide inquiry into clerical abuse. The report raises renewed concerns about how Italy's Catholic hierarchy has handled allegations that have long sustained the global church's reputation. Now, while the Vatican has taken steps to address the crisis, Italy remains one of the few major Catholic nations without a comprehensive, independent investigation. Why has the Italian church, despite years of exposure elsewhere, been slow to open its own inquiry? We see that according to the report, 1,106 priests were implicated alongside nuns, teachers, and lay volunteers. 4,625 recorded victims. 4,395 were allegedly abused by priests. Most survivors, 4,451, were minors, and more than 4,000 were male. Others included vulnerable adults and persons with disabilities. Only a small proportion of accused clergy faced disciplinary action. Now, out of 1,106 suspected offenders, 76 were tried under church law, 17 suspended, and 18 defrocked or resigned. Does this limited accountability reflect systemic gaps in church justice or reluctance to confront internal wrongdoing? The Italian Bishops' Conference declined to comment on the figures, however, days after being criticized by the Vatican's Child Protection Commission for slow responses to abuse cases. Only 81 of Italy's 226 dioceses replied to a recent Vatican questionnaire on safeguarding practices. Meanwhile, Pope Leo, who met with abuse survivors this week, urged bishops not to conceal misconduct. Yet, advocates say the gap between papal directives and local implementation remains wide. Can the Vatican's renewed pressure translate into concrete reforms, or will institutional inertia persist? Like we are seeing here, with the growing calls for transparency and justice, the Church faces a defining question. How long can moral authority stand unshaken while silence shields systemic abuse? A critical question, and the Church would need to answer that question. Now, moving on to the United States, talking about the United States politics, leaked text messages from private group chats involving the United States politicians and parties, different parties, talking about the Republican and the Democratic members of both the U.S. parties, have exposed the racist and violent language sparking outrage, resignations, and renewed debate about the culture of online political spaces in the U.S. The messages obtained by Politico and National Review revealed slurs against Black people, anti-Semitic remarks, praise for Adolf Hitler, and references to political violence. And I'll say the revelations raise concerns about the normalization of hate speech and extreme ideology in American politics. More than 2,900 pages of messages reviewed by Politico show that a group of young Republican leaders exchanged racist and anti-Semitic comments between January and August. The New York Young Republicans Club was later disbanded by the state's GOP Executive Committee, and several members lost leadership positions. Now, in another case, National Review reported that Democratic candidate Jay Jones, seeking to become Virginia's top law enforcement officer, sent a 2022 text suggesting violence against Republican rival. Jones has since apologized. A new poll shows his support has dropped sharply. President Donald Trump's nominee for a federal watchdog post, Paul Ingrassia, also withdrew his this week after messages surfaced in which he described himself as having a Nazi streak. His lawyer claimed the texts were manipulated or taken out of context. But is that true? Experts in political discourse say the leaks expose how private digital platforms create an illusion of safety and intimacy. Encrypted group chats often give participants a false sense of trust, even though digital messages remain permanent and vulnerable to exposure. Observers note that the rise of edgelord culture, a trend where individuals use shocking or taboo language to assert identity or relevance, has blurred the boundary between humor, hate, and political loyalty. Such rhetoric, once confined to the internet's fringes, now appears in mainstream political conversations. And that's the shift we are seeing in the political landscape in America today. Analysts also link the shift to the influence of social media and political leaders who use provocative language to energize their base. Critics argue that rhetoric, once considered unacceptable before 2017, has gradually entered public discourse, reshaping norms of political communication. As the fallout continues, civil society groups have urged political leaders to condemn hate speech within their ranks and strengthen accountability systems. The controversies have led to multiple firings, resignations, and the loss of party positions. Across the 2,900 pages of leaked messages, participants referred to Black people using racial slurs and made violent references to gas chambers. At least 2 members involved have apologized publicly, while party officials describe the behavior as disgraceful and contrary to party values. The revelation raises key questions. What drives political figures to express hate-filled views in private forums? And how does digital communication reshape the boundaries of responsibility and trust in American politics? As the United States heads toward another election cycle, the leaks have deepened concerns about how online culture, anonymity, and polarization are influencing the moral fabric of each political class. Now, moving on over to Madagascar. In Madagascar, we are having a breaking news right here. Madagascar's President Rajolina's citizenship as former aide has held a money laundering probe. Madagascar's former president, Andry Rajolina, has been stripped of his citizenship after fleeing the country amid youth-led protests and a military coup earlier this month. The move came as his former advisor and businessman, Maminaina Ravatomanga, was arrested in Mauritius on allegations of laundering more than $160 million through assets in the country. Authorities in Mauritius confirmed that Ravatomanga was detained by police and officials of the Financial Crimes Commission, FCC, while seeking medical treatment at a private clinic in Port Louis. The FCC said the arrest was linked to assets suspected to represent proceeds of criminal activity. Ravatomanga, who left Madagascar shortly after Rajolina's departure, remains under investigation. His lawyer, Siddhartha Hawaldar, confirmed his client's arrest but declined to comment on the charges. We see that this case and this situation, this story follows what we are saying, that Rajolina's downfall followed weeks of nationwide demonstrations over power shortages, rising living costs, and corruption. His government collapsed when an elite military unit seized power, forcing him to flee the country, claiming threat to his life. The new administration announced that Rajolina had been stripped of Malagasy citizenship after it was confirmed he had acquired French nationality in 2014 in violation of national law. Coup leader Michael Randrianirina was sworn in as interim president on October 17, pledging to restore stability and organize elections within 2 years. Rajolina's current whereabouts remain unknown. Well, as this news unfolds, we'll definitely bring you up to speed with the stories as they unfold. With this, we'll be heading over to groundbreaking reports coming from the home front with Star Smart.
The air in Cameroon is thick with uncertainty as the nation awaits the official presidential election results. Now, what began as a tense vote has spiraled into widespread unrest, exposing deep political fractures and reigniting fears of a return to the kind of turmoil that once scarred the country's collective memory. Now, across major cities from Yaoundé to Douala, Garoua, Maroua, protesters have filled the streets demanding transparency and accountability. The demonstrations, which began peacefully after the elections on the 12th of October, have increasingly been met with a heavy-handed government response as expected. Security forces have been deployed in large numbers with reports of fatalities, mass arrests, and restrictions on movement. In several neighborhoods, colonial government offices linked to the ruling Cameroon People's Democratic Movement have been set ablaze, a sign of growing anger amongst disillusioned citizens. Internet blackout and curfews have added to the tension, isolating communities and limiting the flow of information at a time when transparency is most needed. The unrest follows a contentious electoral process marked by controversy long before ballots were cast. Key opposition figures were barred from running, opposition coalitions were declared illegal, and local elections were postponed to a later date, moves that many observers viewed as favoring the incumbent president. As a result, confidence in the Electoral Commission and other state institutions has plummeted, leaving large sections of the population skeptical of the outcome even before it is officially announced. Now, for the French government, Cameroon government, the priority has been maintaining control and projecting stability. Yet in doing so, it risks deepening the very divisions that it seeks to contain. The use of force to silence dissent has created an atmosphere of fear and resentment, echoing the traumas of past political crises that still haunts the nation of La République collective consciousness. Now, beyond the political turmoil lies a complex web of challenges. The country continues to grapple with economic stagnation, inflation, and youth and unemployment, problems now worsened by the instability in the southern Cameroon, where conflict and mistrust has persisted for a decade. Now, the disputed election has only reinforced the feelings of exclusion and marginalization and the reason why they continue to fight for their sovereignty. The French Cameroon's government's emphasis on order and unity faces its greatest test yet. The fragile peace between Cameroon's diverse linguistic and regional communities is under strain, and any perception of political exclusion threatens to unravel decades of efforts towards national cohesion. Now, as the Constitutional Council prepares to announce the final election results on Monday the 27th, the nation stands at a crossroad. The coming days will determine whether Cameroon can navigate its way back towards dialogue and stability, or whether the current crisis will deepen into a new chapter of division and unrest. Well, we see mass arrests of opposition figures and supporters of opposition candidate Issa Chiroma Bakari, reportedly on the way across the country, escalating political tensions just days before the official announcement of the presidential election results, which is expected on Monday, October 27th, as was said. Witnesses and local sources report that security forces have detained several senior members of the opposition and activists aligned with Chiroma's campaign. The arrest comes amid growing uncertainty and accusations of electoral irregularities following last week's vote. The French government has not yet issued an official statement regarding the arrest. However, opposition representatives are condemning the detentions as an attempt to silence dissent and preempt public demonstrations over the contested results. International observers have expressed concerns over the situation, urging authorities to respect due process and ensure transparency as the nation awaits the final tally. Further details remain limited as the situation continues to unfold. And that brings us to the end of the briefings from the home front. A reminder that the ongoing meeting for the Southern Cameroon's presidential selections are going on with the president and other important specific handpicked personalities from the government of Ambazonia, due to the fact that Ambazonia proxies who are collaborating with a such rumor. We see that the president is having an urgent meeting based on this news report we have. He's having an urgent meeting, a cabinet meeting, executive select committee. That's the meeting, executive select committee, to introduce newly appointed leaders, all members of tiers of government. As we know, we have a new vice president and other selected tiers of government. So do stay tuned for that meeting. That'll be all from Undaunted Studios. Thank you for joining.